Kia, and welcome to the Noisy Librarian podcast, brought to you by Te Mata Puna Library and Learning Services. I'm Rachel, your host for today's episode, and this episode is super special. Not only do we have a learning advisor who's not been on the podcast yet before, Craig. Hi, Craig.
Hi.
How are you today?
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Oh, well, we're so happy that you're here. Thank you so much for joining us. So not only do we have Craig, who's a newbie to the podcast, but we also have our first AUT friend. Yay for AUT friends. Woo! So we have Tom, who is joining us from AUTSA. So that's Auckland University of Technology Student Association, for those who don't know. And Tom works for the Advocacy team. So welcome, Tom.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Oh, thank you so much. This is a really interesting episode, and actually, in particularly, I'm excited because we have you, Craig, as our learning advisor and Tom as our kind of student voice. We have experiences and insights from kind of either side of the fence. So I think this is going to be super cool. So that's right, we're going to be talking about AI and academic integrity today. Academic integrity is a super hot topic right now. How do students succeed at assignments without compromising academic integrity? We're going to be talking about cheating, ChatGPT, workshops, and all the support available while studying. For example, AUTSA's advocacy team. So this is a hard topic to kind of launch into and start because the phrase academic integrity, is that a phrase that students are actually familiar with?
The phrase itself at the sort of community level really expresses what are meant to be a bunch of shared values. A lot of it centres really on doing your own work, actually, as a matter of fact. But when you look at the values as they're listed by agreement across universities really around the world, you see things like responsibility and honesty. And these are not just, in a sense, related to doing your own work. They're, in a sense, related to how we agree the academic community will run, in fact, in the same way that we might in any community. And so I think that's important to recognise that when you're thinking about integrity, you are thinking about the way things are done inside communities by sometimes tacit agreement. And I think that's what speaks to your question. Students don't always understand what it means at either the conceptual level or even the behavioural level. So it's common enough for people, for example, to transgress by accident.
Okay, that's really interesting.
So misconduct is not always deliberate.
What do you think, Tom, on that one?
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that, actually. So it is, for the most part, something that most students understand and most students are willing to engage with. And even before we saw the rise of AI and contract cheating services before that, most of the academic integrity issues that you'd run into were largely through students that didn't understand the sort of grey area between collaborating with their peers and crossing over into that sort of academic dishonesty space. And most of these students wouldn't even think of themselves as dishonest. They're often in a position where they believe in all seriousness that they're doing the right thing, and it's very rarely an issue where you've got the sort of moustache-twirling villain that you might think of when you think of a cheater. It's usually someone who's confused or who might not have the best command of English, or might otherwise just struggle a little bit with academic writing, and that's where you see those transgressions. And most people, I think, find that doing their own work and working within those bounds kind of comes naturally. And that's something that's kind of been evergreen. It really does predate all of this, and I think it actually has persisted into this sort of era of AI that we're looking at now.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you say, of course, that I guess it's kind of like a tale as old as time. As long as there's been opportunities to do this kind of work, there's been an opportunity to, for want of a better phrase, cheat or try to game the system. So, these tools necessarily aren't new. Like you were alluding to, Tom, there've been essay writing services and other bits and pieces, but AI seems to have just kind of skyrocketed into the kind of popular mind with ChatGPT. I guess, have both of you ever played around with it? Because when I first heard of it, I had no idea what it was. I didn't know how to do it. And in fact, a colleague of mine said, "Oh, come and sit with me and I'll show you." We just ended up writing a really silly story about penguins or something. Like, ChatGPT, write me a story about penguins. And I guess initially I didn't see it as something to be concerned about. I thought, wow, this is a really cool piece of tech. But now actually in the education space, it's really kind of become a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what you think, Tom, but I've used it extensively. I mean, I used 2.1 as the first version I used in 2018. It's up to, 4.5 exists, but they haven't let it go yet.
Wow.
It's part of my role, really, and part of my sort of position as an academic, in a sense, to understand what these tools can and can't do. The one thing I would say is that I've struggled to bring it into my own actual workflow, which is one of the interesting questions. In one or two pertinent cases, it's allowed me to do things that I couldn't do before. But generally speaking, I've been experimenting to try to understand how students, for example, might use it, what they might get out of it. Not in the sense of academic misconduct, though, but what can it and can't do.
Absolutely, because I guess it's got implications in terms of actually producing content, but also acting as a search platform, kind of a research capability that is kind of like two strings to their bow, as it were.
Yeah, there have been quite a few instances, both in the academic space and outside of it, where there have been folks who predominantly use it as a search engine, or at least claim that they did. And one of the things that we got told quite early on in my own classes this year is you had better not use it for any of your studies. And they actually cited a recent situation in the States where a lawyer actually used it as part of his legal research, and it invented cases that didn't actually exist. Now, the judge didn't like that much.
I bet not.
Well, the judge looked for the cases, as lawyers do, of course.
Yeah, it did. Yeah,
they didn't exist. Oh my goodness.
No, but then he asked, hey, can you tell me more about these cases? I haven't seen them before. And then he kind of, the lawyer doubled down by asking ChatGPT to come up with the details of those cases. So that made things a little bit worse. But I've seen it used in a variety of different ways. I've definitely seen it used to really act as an editing tool to try and create the best possible statements. I've seen other AI models used as a method of producing art, especially backgrounds for paintings and that sort of thing, because backgrounds are usually pretty labor intensive. And I've definitely seen it used as a sort of tool of the trade, but in terms of its academic and work applications, I haven't had the chance to really look through that.
And your lecturer made it quite clear to you guys not to use it in your studies. So yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, though. I mean, lecturers at AUT, for example, have really been given that remit, send a clear message to their cohorts, what's acceptable, what's not. Those who are unsure, which I think is totally legitimate at this point, because we're in a highly experimental stage.
Absolutely.
People are trying to work out what it can and can't do. They're tending to say, don't use it for now. I think Tom's example is really important, though. What that lawyer, they failed the single greatest test. AI doesn't change the fact that you still have responsibility for the output. And so he failed that particular test. That's what we're really going to start to send, a message we're going to send to the students. It's fine in some senses for this to generate things for you, but you still have that overarching responsibility to look at what it's generated. Now, if you are just getting it to do your work for you rather than with you, which is rather what Tom was talking about, your critical sense of what it said and its accuracy will be incredibly low, and you're likely to fail.
Oh yeah,
in that particular standard.
Yeah, actually that was a bit of a scandal that we had in one of my classes this year. Was just started making up sources, and the lecturer had a massive sense of humour failure about that. And the first question that you're really going to ask in those sorts of cases is, I haven't seen any of these before. Can you walk me through what happened? And this is what happened in this case. The students usually said, no, actually, I just put whatever it spat out into my assignment, so can't help you.
So in fact, checking the work is, one thing to be doing. You can't just rely on it as a kind of one single source of truth or accuracy. It could kind of be spitting out anything, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, it kind of turns us back round to academic integrity. So fine, if it's in your assignment brief and if you have clear instructions on how to use it, you still, like you were saying, Craig, have that responsibility. This is still your work. And, we did a great campaign. We worked with AUTSA, and one of our kind of taglines, for want of a better phrase, was, it's your work, it's your success. So in fact, I think there is that compromise for using great tools like this to elevate and to succeed, but it has to be kind of done in the right way.
Yeah. Responsibility is one of those values in the standard definition of academic integrity. It's important to realise that those values they're inward-facing and outward-facing. We have a responsibility to the community as well.
Absolutely.
To propagate accurate information.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've noticed, and one of the things that really sort of ties into the way that especially ChatGPT gets used at the moment is, even predating it, a lot of the students that came to us with academic integrity issues were usually students that are in a real state of confusion. What they really wanted most of the time was somebody to audit their work and say, your academic writing is okay, right? Or you are communicating this, you're going to pass this assessment because you're meeting the learning outcomes and that sort of thing. And a lot of the infrastructure available to them can't do that quite at the level that they often want, because it would pretty much amount to doing the entire assignment for them or auditing it fully. And what I think is really tempting for a lot of the students that we've seen come through in this year has been that ChatGPT sort of purports to offer that. It kind of shows itself as being, this could be an editing tool, this could be something that really writes to that standard for you. And that's why there's that temptation there, and it's why we've had quite a few students that have fallen into that trap. And a lot of the students that are doing that usually don't really consider a lot of the risk of getting caught or anything like that. It's more, here's a usable tool, maybe the university hasn't found ways to spot it yet, but more or less it's a balancing exercise between, I need this help, and what's the likelihood of me getting caught?
And I think, it's interesting in terms of what you were saying about the services that are available, whether the students know about them, whether they can access them. ChatGPT is free, which I guess puts it in a bit of as a front runner versus other services they might engage, because like essay writing services, etc., they cost a lot of money, which people just do not have. So it is packaged in a very appealing way, as you say. And I think, Craig, often we know this in Te Mata Puna, students tend to arrive at the point of need. My essay is due, I'm struggling, it's due tomorrow, it's due at midnight, and we have to say to them, that's too late to kind of engage with us on some of this stuff. We do our best, but...
Yeah, I think the point there is presence that Tom's talking about. I mean, they can come to a person like me and receive sage advice and pertinent feedback on an existent text, for example, but when they're in there addressing perhaps the feedback and working on it, then they don't have a hotline to Craig to say, hey, Craig, when you said that, did you mean this? I think the thing we have to realise is hybridity is already a thing. Yeah, so this type of interaction between humans and tools, and remember these are called productivity tools. So they are designed for the sort of use, at least purportedly, that Tom's talking about to help you when you're in the flow of your own work. But all of the various pilots fulfill that role, and they are right there. And you can simply say, what do you reckon about this, or is this accurate? There's no particular question in my mind that that's something that people are already doing. And what the students that we've been able to find out from around the world say is that it helps. And I don't think there's a decent argument for resisting that type of help, honestly.
One of the things that I think ties into that is that there's always been this sort of need for immediacy when it comes to those sorts of tools. I mean, before that, there were, of course, those contract cheating sites that would help you, Chegg and the like. But before that, there was this conflict around whether you'd use things like Wikipedia or any of those sorts of things. And one of the ways that that's really been portrayed as, well, this could be a conduit to find good sources, but it's not a crutch that you're supposed to use a lot of the time, and you shouldn't cite it yourself. One of the things that you do tend to notice is that usually students are made aware of a lot of the help that's available quite early on, usually in orientation week or very early on in the semester. And regardless of how many reminders they get over the course of the semester, usually by the time they're aware that they need that help, it usually is the 11th hour, and that's why there are those sorts of this is due at midnight kind of
we've all been there.
Exactly. And by that point, usually there's not a lot of thought about what things were available to me, what things could I have looked at, especially if a student has been behind the whole time. The idea of taking on more work or extra obligations to go out and seek that information is usually quite laborious, and it's not something that they can often spare the time or the energy to do. And it's one of those things you see where everything gets a little bit out of control, where it all kind of piles on and on, and by the time they get to this point, it's just a panicked mess.
It's a good point, Tom. What you're describing is a developmental skills. So the analogy is really interesting with rules for misconduct. Now, we know that we can state rules. We have laws everywhere. You're a lawyer. Okay. We also know that people's ability and willingness to transgress those laws is fairly open, right? I know the speed limit in certain places is 50. I look at my Speedo and it says 55, and I think, whatever.
Shh,
right?
Craig, don't say that.
Actually, I don't have a license, but it's
sounds like.
And so we know that if you know the rules against that, that sort of stipulate what's acceptable and unacceptable, that doesn't equal behaviour that matches the rules. Yeah. And so, all right, we often know the right thing to do, but then we think, well, crikey, okay, I've got 3 assignments due tomorrow. My behaviour is probably not going to match the standard. Yeah. And so we as in the library and Te Matapuna, I think we find ourselves in the same situation where we have to try to get to the right moment to help people navigate that. But we can't be there all the time. And I would suggest to you, without losing my job in the future, that there will be moments in the next sort of 6 to sort of 24 months where actually what I'll be doing is helping students use those tools that are available and guiding them and saying, well, actually, how would we use it? If it's 12:30 at night and I've got to hand it in tomorrow morning and you've got a draft and you're thinking, crikey, is that true or is that accurate or how's my writing? How do you use a tool, an in-house AI tool, to help you do it? And I think, honestly, there'll be a moment in the future where people go, why were we so worried about this? Because it'll become a little bit like second nature, so that hybridity will be normal. Mm-hmm. It is nearly normal already.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
But the ethical moment of, okay, but I have to be sure of what it says won't change.
Yeah. No, and that's the thing about this, is that this is sort of the reality that we're living now. This is here, it's here to stay, and my impression of it, as we've seen this development over the last 6 months, we've really seen it in this space, but it's only going to get better. And the real question there is really how to hybridize it, because this semester, I think what my experience has been is some lecturers have said, I have developed this assignment specifically so it's impossible for you to use AI to effectively use that, which is optimistic.
You're likely to be false, is what you mean.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
I imagine people get pretty creative.
Oh, they do. No, I guarantee it didn't stop anyone. Like, some folks see that sort of thing and take it as a challenge. Some of them are. It doesn't change the fact that the desperation is still there. And I think it is really, really nice to be looking at it in this way, as a sort of how can we fit this into the way that you produce work, rather than how can we catch people who are using it and punish them. I think there's still going to be a line somewhere, and obviously when people cross that, that's probably where my office is going to get a call, inevitably. But it isn't this sort of boogeyman that need threaten the entire sanctity of academic rigor, right? There are ways to work this in here, and I think part of that is also going to be just seeing how prevalent it's becoming in industry. And academia really has to reflect industry in a great way.
Yeah, so I think those skill sets will have to be identified. I mean, that'll take some time again. That's what I mean by experimentation. Many lecturers are just like myself. They're trying to work out to what extent these tools can be used. I think the law is interesting. At the moment, the lawyers are digging their heels in and saying, no, you've got to do it yourself. But if you consider the types of text generated by the law, they're extremely regimented. Yeah. And these generative tools are very good at that, actually. So there's a moment where certain types of text, as long as the information has veracity, like you said, check these cases and write this or produce this type of document, there's no question that it'll be incredibly, incredibly productive for them. It'll just speed stuff up.
Oh, it will. There are situations, and we experience this in advocacy too, because it's a bit like doing law, except it's nowhere near on the same level. But when you've got a pretty enormous database or an enormous amount of information that's dumped on your desk, and I'll add that some people do that on purpose just to bog you down. It's always nice to have those tools that are there to try and find the sort of pertinent things that you're going to need. That's something that we're going to see kind of pop up in law in the future and everything like that. I don't think there's a worry that it's going to replace advocates, that it's going to replace lawyers, or replace law students, because there's always, at the very least, there's always going to be that human element that people really need. And hey, even in the work I do, there are a lot of times where what people really need is somebody to sit down with and talk person to person and say, look, this is what's been going on. But as a research tool, or as a way of sort of cutting the wheat from the chaff, if you can audit it properly and see, hey, this is correct, this is accurate, I can cite this and talk about it properly, I think it's going to be a really useful supplementary tool. I suppose the reality that we're living at the moment is that people are still getting in trouble for treating it as a crutch, as I said before, but that's not always going to be the case, and I think it'll be interesting to see how things develop over the next few months, the next few years for that matter.
Yeah, and we actually don't quite know to what extent people are getting in trouble yet.
Yeah,
what we do know about academic misconduct is that there's a sort of an 8% group in any university on the planet that tends to be that Moriarty, insofar as they've made a certain decision at a certain point to transgress no matter what, whether they've got too much else to do or whatever. So there is a small group, and that's a very consistent group since the 90s, It doesn't look like that group is really increasing en masse. There are certain instances where, people are saying, I just asked this person, did they get it generated by ChatGPT? And they said, yeah. And then we said something like, well, it would be better to do your own work. We don't really have a rule that takes care of this type of transgression, That's clearly not plagiarism at the moment, at the most technical level, because ChatGPT is a generative tool. It generates unique content based on models, so it drags stuff from everywhere, but it's not doing what we used to call plagiarism, which is you decide to use my text to generate your own text, So we're at a stage where, and AUT is at the stage of rewriting its rules for misconduct because they really don't apply as much anymore.
In fact, I will do a quick shameless plug for Craig here, because you were featured on a really fantastic panel on AI for Tech Week. So we'll include that link in the episode description if you want to listen to a bit more about that. But these conversations are taking place at the highest level. And you were sitting next to the Vice Chancellor, talking about these topics. So it's kind of like front of mind for a lot of institutions.
It is, and the importance is this type of conversation, actually, because we don't really understand the use cases yet. We have a sense of it, and it's being generated by colleagues around the world, and students are coming forth and saying, look, when I'm in a lecture and the lecturer explains something, often I just go to ChatGPT and it explains it more simply. These things are coming consistently, and honestly, as a learning advisor, I think that's a no-brainer. I think, well, why wouldn't you? If you understand it, and you're in this live event trying to understand something that you need to understand. We're getting a sense of that. But particularly at the AUT level, we're near to having to try to understand better what people like yourself are doing, Tom, and the challenges you're facing, mostly because actually they're very similar to the lecturer's challenges, actually. There's these potential users wondering, how can I use it? What does it do? Like you said. And then in some cases, is this okay?
I think I could definitely understand the use of it as a way of following up on the things the lecturer is saying, because one thing you definitely notice is that people are very nervous about putting their hands up and saying, I don't understand, in a lecture or a tutorial environment. No one wants to be that person, and I like to ask really dumb questions. In fact, it's safe to say I tend to do it as a living. But, it's a real skill that not everyone has, especially if you're young, especially if you're not, you haven't got people around you that are going to be going to pat you on the shoulder and say, I was wondering that too. I guarantee people are, but most people, they're not thinking about that in a moment. So you can see really the temptation there. And I think one of the big things that's going to really reaffirm the way that this is used is the way that academic integrity meetings themselves go. Usually if it's a first time meeting for some breach, whatever it is, and it's not something that would lead to you failing the paper, most of the time it's a pretty small, low-key meeting with an academic integrity officer, and usually also an expert in whatever field that is. The purpose of those meetings at that level is to be educative and to say, look, these are the skills that you need to develop. And usually part of that is going to be a requirement to attend a library workshop and to talk through how you can really develop those skills and avoid having it happen again. And I think that mentality is something that's just going to have to be reaffirmed in the way that academic integrity, anything is handled, as we really start to see AI become a more consistent part of students' education. It's going to be about learning where that line is, where you're kind of straying through the grey area into something that's over the line, and really that's going to have to require them to define where that line is in the first place.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think you're beginning to talk there about the work that you do and your team do at AUTSA's advocacy team. So perhaps we can turn our attention onto that for a moment. So in fact, AUTSA, I would say in general, is a friend of the student. You know, it's a fantastic safe space to get help and advice and guidance on lots of things. So would you say that's a right way to describe the advocacy team? You know, you're talking about being educative and whatnot. You're a group that can be approached by students on these type of things?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the most important things that I usually talk through with students is AUTSA is independent from the university, so we contract with them to provide vital student services, and advocacy is one of those. The reason that I always bring up that we're independent is that it's a place where students can talk freely about what they've been going through, and they know that we're not going to go back and tell their lecturers or tell their parents or anything along those lines. And those are usually the big things that students are worrying about. I've had embassies call me in the past and I've told them, no, I can't comment on this student. You know, that's the sort of level that we're operating at here. And it's a place where not only can we provide assistance for students that are not only in academic integrity situations, but also who need to lodge a complaint against a lecturer or who wish to challenge their grades, or sometimes they really just need to know the right way forward because their semester has gone completely to custard. And our real role is to listen to them in this sort of non-judgmental space where they're able to speak confidentially and provide them the help that they need. Now, while we are independent from the university, we coordinate quite closely with a lot of those sorts of student services, and obviously we're really eager to continue and expand our work alongside the library as well, which I think is going to be our sort of big next goal. But yeah, we're really there to help, and we're a very reactive service. So usually when a student writes in or visits, we're able to see them very shortly after they turn up, or we're able to book something quite quickly. But one of our big bread and butter things is academic integrity meetings where a student needs someone to help represent them and sit in the room with them while they explain what's going on. And that's how we know that a lot of the time it's a student that has just become quite overwhelmed by things and they've done something that they recognise now was the wrong thing to do, but they weren't thinking in the moment. Very common. There's no shame in it. We've heard it a million times, and we understand that it's something that is just a reality of being a student sometimes, especially when you're under a lot of pressure and when you might need a bit more assistance academically. And that's something that we're always able to help with. A lot of the time, the first thing we'll say is, hey, you're not going to get kicked out of the university, which is usually the case. It's very rare that anybody is ever going to get kicked out the first time. I've never seen it happen in all the years I've been doing this job. But you know, and usually that's enough to sort of get the dialogue going. Say, hey, there's your good news.
Yeah, let's start with the good news.
Yeah, they're not going to drop a hammer on your head. You're fine. But let's talk about what to expect out of all of this and how we can help with all of this. And having no surprises in those spaces is usually really encouraging to students that are quite worried about what's going to happen.
I think,
they need a pressure release. Yeah,
it is a pressure release, and I think actually AUT specifically, we often have a lot of students coming who are first in their families. Everyone's very proud. There is a lot of pressure at home. There's a pressure from the physical act of studying, from your lecturers, from your friends who seem to be doing really well. You know, like we were alluding to, this issue is complex. It's not you're a cheater, you're a bad person. It's so complex, and I think what AUTSA does is kind of help these people to realise that you're okay, will help you to get over this blip in what's happening, in the majority of cases.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, even if there's something that's going to result in some kind of punishment or whatever, it's not even really a punishment most of the time, but it is usually a requirement to do the assessment again, or there'll be something along those lines. We're able to at least get people ready for that and help them challenge the outcome if there's been some sort of additional information they want to provide, or if the outcome is a bit too severe for them. At the end of the day, one of the things that we tend to see is that a lot of these students, they usually are first in family, as you said. They might be from overseas. They've got a lot of familial pressure where their parents have paid a whole boatload of money for them to be here and studying, and they are struggling, and they are very upset that they're struggling because they shouldn't, because a lot of the time university is sold as a sort of next step in your life after you finish high school. And when you run into that trouble, and when you run into trouble in that space and you bounce off of it, or it's just much harder than you ever thought possible, because the the nature of university can be so different from high school. It's really difficult for them, and this is where we get into things like this. I would say a good 98% of the students that we deal with in our space are not people that would describe themselves as trying to game the system or do anything, unethical. They are panicking, and they just do whatever they can to try and alleviate some of that pressure and manage. And that's usually what we're able to bring up in these sorts of meetings. It is important. It matters. And it is something that, for the most part, academic integrity officers are very good at taking on board when they come to make decisions about this. And obviously, we don't want things to get to that point. And I think one thing that all of us in this room are trying to do is, even with this very podcast, is try and help students to avoid getting to that stage in the first place.
Absolutely.
But it isn't the end of the world if you do get there. There are things that we can do to assist.
Yeah, it's something of a misunderstanding to go that far. I think the other point you've got to make, though, is that the success in this case is not about avoiding punishment. The success is about understanding the basic tenets of your field more strongly, right? So it's about learning.
It is.
And at that point, when you put it down to that level, really what you're looking at is competing strategies. And what is a strategy? Strategy is a way to do something that you previously couldn't do, essentially. So in some cases, plagiarism or any of the traditional ones, or getting ChatGPT to build out a few paragraphs for you, is just a strategy. Deeply flawed one, but there are others. And in fact, some of them, as we're discussing, might combine those things as well. So there's a sense where they just get an idea of other ways to go about it. Time will always be an issue.
It will.
But we know that in a place like the university, we usually have a great deal more flexibility than we publicise.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I've been an assessment manager in large universities in Australia, and I've only ever met 2 people I would characterise as the supervillain. And they were at a very high level. In fact, they've been incredibly successful right through to postgraduate. And one of them was asked, not so politely, or actually basically booted out. But the ramifications of his misconduct were ethically appalling. It wasn't just that he cheated the system, but the results that he was publicising were false and involved people in a very vulnerable group, But in the profiling of him, he'd been up to sort of no good for virtually the entirety, of the 6 years he'd been in Australia. But he's a unique individual in that respect. Everybody else is, as you characterise, things got on top of me, and so I did it because it solved my problem then and there, and here I am now.
I think I'd agree with that. There's the vast majority of people are those people in crisis, or who just don't know what tools are available. Sometimes it's people that don't even know that you're allowed to apply for special consideration if you get sick and need some extra time to do your assessment. And most of the time you'll have one of these meetings and that student will be gone for good, and they'll carry on, with their new knowledge of how to approach things, and they will manage on their own merits. There were only very few cases I could think of in the time I've been doing this where we've had somebody who would be a supervillain. And in that case, it had nothing to do with ChatGPT. That was a completely different methodology that went into some very, very strange territory to the point where, where it was, it's very difficult to argue on their behalf. But at the end of the day, we do have that responsibility to do so, and we do our best regardless. But most of these folks are really just in crisis. They need assistance, and most of the time we can talk them through what to expect. Okay, this is business, economics and law faculty. This is what you could expect out of the folks running here. You will get told off, but it is in the name of helping you. And then they'll show you this service, and then you could go out and do that. And my recommendation is go and do that.
The weakness of that model at the moment, and I'm part of that model, in the library in general, is that slightly parallel or exterior aspect to it. Really what we're after, and what our team's trying to achieve actually, is what we call embedding, which is bringing some of those elements into the day-to-day learning and practices of the students in the class. Now, the onus falls a little bit on the lecturers to manage that as well, but one of the things we do is we offer our services directly in that space. So it has some analogy to what you're talking about with ChatGPT being present all the time. Weeks and weeks earlier, we say, you really ought to be thinking about your assignments. What are you thinking about? Not the end. You're thinking about part of the process.
Yeah.
So, there's an onus on the support services to go where the students are.
Absolutely. And I think that leads us very nicely into your library on Canvas. I mean, like you were saying, we try our best to support in a system that may potentially be slightly flawed. But I think your library on Canvas, especially this year, has gone through a bit of a transformation. So we are hopefully making it easier for the students to access the information that they need around things like paraphrasing and things they might not necessarily understand. And like what you were saying, Tom, they might not necessarily put their hand up for. But if it's actually embedded in their assignment, if they can look at these resources on Canvas while they're also looking at their assignments, then hopefully we're planting that seed of it is a journey and a process. It's not just about the end. It's what can I learn in the process of my assignment. So something like your library on Canvas, I think, is a really helpful tool with that.
Yeah, bringing it again towards them. And we've got some local information that the students want that. They say, I don't want to look at it here. I want to look at it here where I am. And it makes perfect sense. And again, it's a little bit like that rules thing. We know the rules. We can all define paraphrasing, but if I say go away and do it, you've got an experiential and a behavioural problem. It's like, well, I don't really know how to do it. I can tell you what it is. I can probably even point to a good example.
Yeah.
But when it comes to actually the nitty-gritty and the nuts and bolts of doing it, that's where you need help.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think things like our workshops are great for that type of practical application. So again, doing the shameless plugs. But if you head on to your library on Canvas, you can book workshops on there with the library services, and you can also do it through library website. So if you can educate yourself ahead of the time, then maybe you can manage your time effectively. You can reduce that stress and that pressure so you don't panic and go down a route you might not necessarily have wanted to go down in the first place.
Yeah.
Well, I think before we wrap it up, so that's some of our library services there. So your library on Canvas, our workshops there. In terms of AUTSA and Advocacy group, what could students do? Where can they find information? How can they contact you?
Absolutely. So AUTSA provides a variety of student services and also embodies our Student Representative Council, which of course students can run for if they wish. So we're present on all campuses in a sort of physical format. As of now, we've got advocates on all 3 campuses too. And on top of that, we also have the club space where we're able to offer those sort of student communities and a nice directory of groups that you're able to join. Those 2 are present on all 3 campuses. We've also got Tautoko, which is a food bank and a nice little supply store that's also present on all 3 campuses for if you're in a great deal of hardship and need that extra support. And of course, we have the advocacy service here now. We've got QR codes that you can scan on your phone all over, again, all 3 campuses, where you get immediately into our sort of email inbox if you'd like to request a meeting or just ask a question. Our service is free. All of our services are free to use. Just remember, again, completely confidential. And at the end of the day, we're here to help. It's a purely non-judgmental space, and our role is to help you.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. So thank you very much for listening. You can find us on Podbean, Apple and Google Podcasts, and iHeartRadio. You can also follow Te Mata Puna, Library and Learning Services, on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. Don't forget to check out AUTSA's info at autsa.org.nz and on Instagram as well. See you next time. Thank you, guys. That was a really wonderful session. That was amazing.
I told you that we can talk about scrap.